Mustapha was beside himself with rage and fear. Just as he had thought himself about to accomplish his design, this wretched little creature came to frustrate it. There was only one thing to be done. He must kill the little horror, and he sprang out of his bed, meaning to catch him, but the dwarf had guessed what might happen and was prepared for him. Dropping his lamp, he made for the door, screaming hastily for help. Mustapha was now in sad straits, and all present hope of rescuing the two girls was at an end. He had to think only of his own safety. He looked out of the window and found it was some distance from the ground, and that there was a high wall he would have to scale as well. However, as he stood considering, he heard voices approaching, and just as the door was about to be burst open, he jumped from the window, ran across the courtyard, and, climbing the wall nimbly, had soon left his enemies behind. He never stopped running until he had reached the shelter of a wood, and then he threw himself down, quite exhausted, to try and think what he should do next. Of course he had lost his horses and his servants, having left them behind him at Thuli's house, but he still had a good sum of Orbasan's money in his girdle. Very soon he had invented another plan to save his sister. He continued his way through the wood until he reached a village, where he purchased a horse at a low price, which speedily carried him to a town. Here he sought out a physician and offered him several pieces of gold on consideration that he would concoct a draught which would give all the semblance of death without harming the patient, and another draught to counteract the effect of the first. Having made his bargain, he bought a false beard, a black gown, and all sorts of vials which a physician would be likely to have. He strapped his baggage on the back of a donkey and retraced his steps to Thuli's house. He was so changed in appearance that he scarcely knew himself, and had little fear of being recognized by Thulikos or anyone else. He arrived at the palace and announced himself as a physician, Chakaman Kabudi Baba. Everything happened as he wished it to do. The old man was so taken by his high-sounding name that he at once asked him to enter and take a seat at his table. After some conversation, in which Mustapha managed to give the impression that he was a very learned man, Thuli said he would take this opportunity of having all his slaves examined and ascertain the state of their health. Mustapha was overjoyed to think that he was so soon to see his beloved sister again, but in this he was mistaken. Thuli conducted him to his seraglio, it is true, but when they reached a splendidly furnished room, there was no one in it. "Chambaba, or whatever your name may be, dear doctor," said Thuli, "behold this opening in the wall. Through this, each of my slaves shall pass her arm, and you can feel her pulse, and ascertain the state of her health." Mustapha made some objection to this arrangement, but Thuli would not consent to alter it, only he did consent to give a few hints as to the previous state of their healths. Drawing a strip of paper from his girdle, Thuli now began to call out the names of his slaves, and as he called, the slave who answered to the name slipped her hand through the opening. 6 times had Mustapha felt the pulses and pronounced 6 slaves in good health, and then came the name of Fatima. Trembling with joy, Mustapha grasped the little white hand and then, with a grave air, pronounced the patient to be very ill. Thuli was very much concerned and asked the wise Chakaman Kabudi Baba to prepare a medicine for her, which could not fail to cure her. Mustapha left the room and wrote the following message: "Fatima, I will save you if you will consent to the following plan. I will give you a draught which will make you appear dead for 2 days. I have another draught in my possession which will restore you. If you consent, pretend that the simple draught I will send you has been of no avail. I shall know this is a sign that you agree, and will see that the more potent draught is given you next." He soon returned to the room where Thule awaited him, bringing with him a harmless draught which he handed to Fatima. He felt her pulse once more, and managed at the same time to slip the little note under her bracelet. Thule was so distressed about Fatima's illness that he thought of no one else, and put off the medical examination of the other slaves until a more convenient season. When he and Mustapha had left the room, he said to him sorrowfully, "Chadi Baba, tell me frankly what you think of Fatima's state." "Alas," answered the wise physician, heaving a deep sigh, "may the Prophet give you consolation, for I cannot. Fatima is suffering from a malignant fever, from which I am afraid she will not recover." Far from appreciating the plain speaking he had begged for, Thule flew into a great rage. "You wretched quack!" cried he. "Do you mean to say that the slave, for whom I paid 2,000 gold pieces, is to die like an old cow? Take note. If you do not manage to save her life, I will have you beheaded." Mustapha saw that he had made a mistake and tried to reassure Thule. Just then, a black slave came to tell the physician that the medicine had done no good. "Exert your whole skill, Chakam Dababelda, or whatever your name may be. I will make it worth your while to cure her," shrieked Thule, almost weeping to think of the possible loss of his 2,000 gold pieces. "I will give her a draught that is almost certain to relieve her," answered Mustapha. "Yes, yes," sobbed the old man. "By all means, give her another draught." Well pleased, Mustapha slipped away to fetch the sleeping draught, which he gave to the black slave to give to Fatima. Then, saying that he needed to gather a few healing herbs which grew on the banks of the lake, he hurried out of the palace. As soon as he reached the bank, he took off his disguise and cast it into the water, where it floated gaily about. Then he hid himself in some bushes and waited for the approach of night, when he went and hid himself in the burial place attached to Thule's palace. Mustapha had scarcely been gone an hour when the black slave came and informed Thule that Fatima seemed at the point of death. The old man at once sent his servants to fetch the doctor, but they returned shortly, saying that he undoubtedly fallen into the water and been drowned, for his black robe was floating upon the surface, and every now and again they had seen his grey beard bobbing up and down. Thule raved like a madman, tore his beard and beat his head against the wall, but all to no purpose, for shortly afterwards Fatima breathed her last. As soon as Thule heard that she was really dead, he ordered her to be taken away to the burial place, for he could not bear having a dead person in the house. The servants who bore her there did but place her on the ground and run away, for they heard such dismal sighs and groans that they were afraid. Of course it was Mustapha who had frightened the servants, and as soon as they were out of the way, he came out of his hiding place and examined the girl he supposed to be his sister. What was his horror to find that the girl who lay in a death-like trance bore no resemblance to Fatima whatever, but was a complete stranger. When he had a little recovered from his disappointment, he reflected it would be cruel to leave the poor girl in the state she was in, and so he uncorked the phial he had brought containing the antidote and poured the medicine down her throat. At once she opened her eyes and began to breathe freely, but it was some little time before she could remember where she was and what had happened. But when she did, she flung herself at Mustapha's feet and thanked him for having rescued her from her horrible captivity. Mustapha questioned her as to how it chanced that he had saved her instead of his own sister, Fatima. She looked at him for some moments in surprise. "Now I begin to understand to what chance I owe my deliverance," she said at length. "Since I have been in Thule's house, I have been called Fatima, which I understand is your sister's name." After some little conversation, Mustapha discovered that Fatima and Zoraida were in the palace, but that, according to Thule's custom, he had given them new names when they became his property, and they were now called Mirza and Nurmahal. Fatima, the rescued slave, could not but see how disappointed Mustapha was, that he had failed in his attempt to carry off his sister, and she did all she could to encourage him to make a further effort, telling him that she had a plan which might prove successful. So Mustapha took heart and questioned her as to how he should set about his task. "I have been a slave in Thule's house for the last 5 months," she said, "and from the first day thought out a means of escape, but it was too difficult to carry out unaided. In the inner courtyard you may have noticed a fine fountain, which casts its water on high, from no less than 10 different jets. Now there was a similar fountain in my father's garden, which was fed by water, conducted to it by an underground passage, and I wished to find out if Thule's fountain was supplied in a similar manner. So one day I began to praise it to Thule, and to say what a clever builder he must have had, to design it. I designed it myself," he said, well pleased, "and what you see is not the most wonderful part about it, for the water has to be brought here from a distance of 1,000 feet at least. I had a lofty arched underground passage built from my courtyard to the brook, and I had the waters of the brook turned into this passage, through which it now flows and supplies my fountain with water. I designed and superintended the building of the whole thing myself." After hearing this, I longed for the strength of a man that might be able to raise one of the stones in the courtyard, reach the underground passage, and be free. I can show you the direction in which this passage lies, and by it you can one night obtain entrance to the palace, but you will need 1 or 2 men to assist you, for you will have to overpower the black slaves who keep watch over the quarters where the women slaves are kept. In spite of the fact that he had already had 2 failures, Mustapha once more took heart, trusting that Allah would allow him to carry out successfully the plan of Fatima, the slave girl. He promised her that he would arrange for her to reach her own home when he had rescued the others, as a reward for lending him her assistance in gaining an entrance to the palace. His principal anxiety was how he should obtain the assistance of 2 or 3 men. Suddenly, he remembered Orbasan's dagger and the promise the robber chief had made that he would come to his aid if ever he were in need of help. So he made haste to leave the burial place, and taking Fatima with him, returned to the town in which he had purchased his physician's disguise, and placed the girl in the charge of a poor but respectable woman. Then, with the last of Orbasan's money, he bought a horse, and set out once more for the robber's dwelling place. He reached it in 3 days' time, and although an unexpected guest, was nonetheless a welcome one. He told Orbasan of his unsuccessful attempts to rescue his sister, and in spite of the gravity of the situation, Orbasan could not refrain from laughing as he pictured his friend decked out as a physician, Chakaman Kabudi Baba. But he was enraged to hear of the treachery of the dwarf, and vowed he would hang him with his own hands as soon as he could catch him. He promised Mustapha that as soon as he was rested and refreshed, he would return with him and help him to carry out his designs. Accordingly, on the following morning, Mustapha and Orbasan, accompanied by 3 of the latter's bravest men, set out for the little town where Mustapha had left the rescued Fatima. They rode so fast that they reached it in 2 days' time, and calling for Fatima, who was to show them the way, rode on to a little wood not far from Thule's palace. Here they hid themselves until nightfall, and then Fatima led the way to the brook which supplied the fountain. Very soon they found the entrance to the underground passage and prepared to descend. One of the men was left in charge of Fatima and the horses, and the rescued slave repeated her directions. They were to traverse the passage until they came to the pipes which supplied the fountain. Having raised one of the flagstones, they would find themselves in the inner courtyard. They would see 2 towers to the right and left of them, and passing through the 6th door from the right-hand tower, they would come into the room where the real Fatima and Zoraida were shut up, watched by 2 black slaves. So, well armed and carrying crowbars with them, Mustapha, Orbasan, and 2 other men climbed down into the underground passage. The water in the passage reached to their middles, but they were nevertheless able to move briskly forward. In half an hour's time, they had reached the end of the passage, immediately below the fountain, and then they began to use their crowbars. The stonework was thick and very strong, but the efforts of the 4 men at length succeeded in forcing an opening sufficiently large for a man to crawl through. Orbasan crept through first and gave a hand to the others. And when they all 4 stood in the courtyard, they gazed around them in order to determine which of the doors was the one described to them. But they were somewhat perplexed, for on counting from the right-hand tower, they found that one door had been walled up, and they were not sure whether Fatima had meant them to count this door or not. But Orbasan did not hesitate long. "My good sword can open any door for me," he said, and advanced towards the one he imagined to be the right one. On opening the door, they discovered 6 black slaves lying fast asleep. They would have retreated silently as they saw they had come to the wrong door, but a figure in the corner raised itself, and a well-known voice began to shriek for help. It was the little dwarf from Orbasan's camp. But before the black slaves knew what was happening, Orbasan had seized the little man. Tearing his girdle into pieces, he stuffed part of it down his throat, and with the rest he tied his hands behind his back. Then he turned his attention to the slaves, several of whom had been bound and gagged by Mustapha and the 2 robbers. In a few moments they were completely overpowered, but were told their lives would be spared on condition that they told where Mirza and Nurmahal were to be found. They confessed that they were in the adjoining room, and on Mustapha hurrying in, he found both Fatima and Zoraida, who had been awakened by the noise. Hurriedly, snatching up their jewels and their clothing, they followed Mustapha out of the palace. The robbers wished to take some plunder with them, but Orbasan forbade it, declaring that it should never be said of Orbasan that he broke into houses by night like a common thief. Mustapha and the rescued girls slipped through the opening in the courtyard into the underground passage, Orbasan promising to follow him immediately, but before doing so, he and one of the robbers took the little dwarf, and leading him into the courtyard, hanged him with a silken rope, which they had brought expressly for the purpose, to the topmost point of the fountain. Having so punished the treachery of the wretched little creature, they also got down into the watercourse and followed Mustapha and the girls. Fatima and Zoraida, with tears in their eyes, would have thanked their noble rescuer from a miserable existence, but he bade them waste no time on words, for it was quite likely that Thulikos would, before long, discover his loss and pursue them. It was with a deep feeling of gratitude that on the following day, Mustapha and the girls bade Orbasan farewell, vowing that they would never forget him. Fatima, the girl who had been rescued, was carefully disguised and then sent to Balsora and put on board a boat which would carry her to her own home. After a short and most successful voyage, Mustapha and the two girls arrived home, and the joy of the old Qadi to see his dearly loved daughter once again was beyond all expression. He gave a great feast to which he invited all his relations and friends, to whom he made Mustapha relate all his adventures. When he had finished speaking, the Qadi solemnly revoked the curse he had put upon his son's head, and taking Zoraida's hand, he placed it in that of Mustapha. "Take her," he said, "as a reward for your unwearied perseverance, and take also the blessing of your aged father, whose earnest wish is that our city may never lack men who, like you, combine tender brotherly affection with wisdom and perseverance." The end. Thank you for listening. Do consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. I have over 100 stories in my channel for you to enjoy. Thanks for giving my small channel a chance to entertain you.